In May of 1856, a pivotal moment in Bleeding Kansas happened. A man by the name of Henry Pate led 750 pro-slavery militiamen into the town of Lawrence. Only one person was killed, but they destroyed the Free State Hotel and 2 printing offices that were in favor of Union. And so John Brown, who was actually living here near Oswatami, he organized the Padawatami Massacre. He and a few of his men went into town with the Padawatami rifles. They found 5 men who were pro-slavers, and they hacked them to death with long swords and sabers in front of their families. In response to this, Henry Pate's men arrested 2 of John Brown's sons. And because, as I was told, John Brown was slightly more level-headed, this influenced his decision at this battle. He surrounded Pate's men and he came up. And they probably wouldn't have won if it weren't for his son Frederick riding through and saying, "We have them surrounded," at which point Pate surrendered. And John Brown gave Pate an offer. He said, "We have 23 men, yourself included, and we will let you go so long as you just release my 2 sons. And so, John Brown's sons were released, and so ended the Battle of Blackjack in 1856. This marker here, right next to the creek, actually marks the position of Henry Pate. And they called these men that he led Shannon's sharpshooters. And he was acting on orders from the U.S. Marshal of this part of Kansas to arrest John Brown for the Padawatami Massacre. And this is kind of where he was cited and where the battle really began to commence. So up here along the Santa Fe Trail, Shannon's sharpshooters under Pate were. But if you pan around, on the western fork of this river, John Brown and his men were lying in wait. It's fascinating to think of kind of pre-Civil War ambushes. And with my habit of collecting stones from battlefields, this is the Battle of Blackjack, right on the western fork of the creek where John Brown and his troops lie in wait in 1856.
Now, the cabin itself was owned by Reverend Samuel Adair and his wife Florella, who bought it from Samuel Glenn, and they moved in spring of 1855. And this was a dangerous thing for them to do because they were abolitionists in the middle of a guerrilla war between pro and anti-slavery settlers, guerrilla fighters, and they were peaceful abolitionists. Florella had a half-brother named John Brown, who was not a peaceful abolitionist. He was a militant abolitionist, and him and his 5 sons, when they formed a guerrilla group, used this cabin as their headquarters. Now, the cabin, the reason that the Adairs allowed this, even though they didn't approve of John Brown's use of violence, was they were concerned about the safety of John Brown's sons' wives. So they allowed them to do that. John Brown and his 5 sons added the loft to the cabin, and John Brown and his son-in-law Henry Thompson added the back room to the cabin.
This was the more active, direct action, anti-slavery headquarters.
All in 1855. The cabin itself is original. It is not a reproduction cabin. The only thing that is not original in the cabin is the floor in the back, part of the ceiling, and the 2 windows in the back. That is because of a fire in 1995. We're not going to fool you into believing there wasn't one. There was one. The textiles have to be replaced in any house museum, if they're honest with you, over time, and the folding chairs are from the 1940s. We can use them until they break. They haven't broken yet.
So the Battle of Oswatami was fought near here?
Yes, it was fought right here on this site, the Battle of Oswatami. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that was John Brown fighting off the pro-slavery?
Yes,
forces?
well, what happened in a nutshell was, what John Brown did was he wanted to prevent the pro-slavery people from coming into town before the Free State settlers who wanted to evacuate the town could make sure that they could safely evacuate the town. It was a delaying action. And what he did was he basically blocked the road into town. And that was turned into the largest battle during the Bleeding Kansas era.
And at what point did the Padawatami Massacre come into play?
That was before, and that was a triggering event. It's a relatively complex thing because what happened was that what preceded it was a series of practical, real threats to the lives of Free State men, and John Brown was one of the cooler heads in the whole thing. In that there were a lot of hot-headed, much more hot-headed abolitionist guerrillas who just wanted to go and start attacking. And Brown said, no. Let's have a fairly organized response. Let's investigate. And he found out that the instigators of the whole thing and the people who were settlers who lived along Padawatami Creek. And they had plans literally to go on a certain day, hook up with around 100 or so men from Georgia who had come up to attack. And what happened was that Brown went down to around modern day Lane and took those men, did what he called what he thought of as a preemptive strike. He investigated, he reconnoitered, and he thought, well, these fellow have, his exact words were that I had established they had committed murder already in their hearts. In other words, they've got plans. I'm going to stop them.
And you mentioned the pro-slavery faction from Georgia. Mm-hmm. Were they involved with the massacre at Cine Creek later?
Some of them probably were, but a lot of those, the thing about it was a lot of the pro-slavery people didn't stay. And one of the differences, one of the things that swung everything in the balance of the Free State side is Free State people stayed. Some of the unsung heroes and heroines in this whole thing are just the ordinary people, Free State abolitionists, who just dug their heels in and said, nope, you can burn my house down, I'll just rebuild it.
And one final question. I noticed on the way up here there was a man flying the Confederate flag. Uh-huh. Do people still feel that John Brown, because I consider him a hero, mm-hmm. Does anybody come in here trying to start things, questioning, like...
Yeah. Yes, I do. I talk with neo-Confederates and people who aren't necessarily neo-Confederates in the sense of the fly the flag in their yard thing. But they come from areas where they have a pro-Confederate view of things. So I get all points of view.
It's mostly peaceful though, right?
Oh yes. It's mostly they have their view, and I listen politely. And my view, basically, I take an academic view, which is that John Brown was an ideologically motivated guerrilla fighter, an activist for civil rights and the abolitionist cause, and that's what he was.
Predating the Civil War were a number of smaller conflicts, county wars, and blood feuds, and I believe one of the most interesting was the Bleeding Kansas War. And the last and most brutal massacre to take place in this war happened here about 1,200 feet from the Missouri border. I'll explain more about how the Kansas War came to be, but this massacre took place when a Georgia native and a pro-slavery leader launched a raid into this area with about 30 men. And the idea was pro-union people would set up camp here in Kansas and then vote to make it a free state. And then pro-slavery leaders would try to bring as much terror against these men as possible. So in comes this Georgia leader of the pro-slave faction, and they find 11 pro-union men or anti-slave men camped near to here. He captures them and starts taking them closer to the Missouri border, and most of them know who this guy is, and they don't figure the pro-Union guys, they don't figure they're about to be massacred. So they're led into a ravine, if you want to pan over there and show the location of it. And the Georgian native actually raises the gun himself and fires the first shot. And he starts ordering his men to shoot, and all of the men except for one are shot. Now 5 are mortally injured, 5 die right there, and then 1 runs off into the hills, and it's from him that we have information about how this unfolded. John Brown, who absolute hero. He was a terrorist, but he was a great man. He came in a few weeks later and built a log cabin near to this house. And this is now called the Hadsell House because John Brown's friend later came here and bought property and constructed this house. So this house is left by John Brown's friend. Brown was in the area, and he led a few men into Missouri where he freed 11 slaves in retaliation for this massacre, and he killed 1 person who opposed him. Now, the leader of the massacre here, he later returned to Georgia, and he died a free man in 1880. And a little note to myself, I'm getting rocks from near to battlefields, and this is at the Marie de Cine battlefield overlooking the house of John Brown's friend. And this is the actual massacre site itself. The cabin was built a little ways away from here, and just up the road about 20 feet is a little monument. And they call this a defile. It's kind of a geographic feature where the limestone runs between 2 hills and a creek passes through it. And up there you can see the monument. We're beginning our bushwhacker and political tour of the Civil War here in the Midwest, and I figured I ought to start with the grave of Cleburne Fox Jackson. Jackson will be remembered as the 15th governor of Missouri and a staunch pro-secessionist. You see, at the beginning of the Civil War, Jackson believed that his state would have aligned with the Confederacy. He came from a family which owned a wealthy plantation with quite a few slaves. In fact, many of them are buried nearby in his family cemetery. And so in February of 1861, he held a vote. And this vote waged 98 as pro-Unionists, and only 1 voted for secession. So Jackson, rather than side with the people, decides to exercise his final power as a state governor in the Union by declaring himself pro-secession. He dissolves his government, or he attempts to. He creates the Independent Republic of Missouri, and then he flees over to Arkansas. Now, for a while, he's in contact with Jefferson Davis, and he's writing him, and he's getting together a 5,000-man force to try to raid this state armory here, but nothing ever really comes of it. They lose the battle, and for the most of the war, this state was an area of partisan warfare, so it wasn't ever firmly in the hands of the Confederates, although they held some territory, because Jackson was mostly down in the Texas-Arkansas border, and it was there that he died of a combination of stomach cancer and pneumonia in December of 1862. But this is the man who attempted to fancy himself as the Confederate dictator of Missouri. In the 1850s, the territories of Nebraska and Kansas were really up in the air. Would they be slave states or would they be free states? And a lot of people from both sides of this discussion, free staters and slave staters, began moving in to influence the elections. Now, the cabin behind me was built in 1854 by the Mayhew family, and in 1855, John Henry Kagi moved in, who was the younger brother of Miss Mayhew. And Kagi was a like a very direct action abolitionist, and he quickly befriended John Brown. And in fact, before a year was over, he moved down to Kansas to join John Brown, where he became his Secretary of War. And Kagi would later be executed, or rather he was killed escaping Harper's Ferry in 1859, West Virginia, on the John Brown raid at Harper's Ferry. And a lot of men who operated out of this cabin would later do this. You see, the story goes that in 1856, I believe, they launched a raid into Missouri on the invitation of one of the slaves there, who essentially wrote to John Brown. And Kagi and John Brown divided into two separate groups, and among these groups were other people that would be killed or executed after Harper's Ferry. And at gunpoint, they forced a couple of families of slaves to be freed. They funneled them through this place, which was at the time the half-breed Indian reservation, and they brought them up to Canada. And it took them a few years to get them up to Canada, but they made their way to freedom. And for that, their families are to this day very grateful. And all of this happened out of this cabin, the Mayhew cabin. You might say that Charles Dow was the first death in the American Civil War. He died shortly before Christmas in 1855, and apparently the conflict wasn't directly over the issue of states' rights or free states. It was the issue of a horse, and it was an argument between him and the guy who owned the property next to him, who apparently Charles was a free stater and the guy next to him was pro-slavery, and he went and he shot Charles Dow. And eventually militias began forming just after this to counter what they viewed as a politically motivated attack. And it didn't help that the guy who killed Charles started saying, oh well, he was pro-freedom, he was pro-union, so that's why I killed him, when it clearly was just an issue of property, or the property of a horse. So Charles Dow was later buried here, but if you want to look around a little bit, this whole cemetery is sort of like a bleeding Kansas screenshot. Another member of Dow's family, Daniel, was killed a few years later in the Battle of Lake Province, Louisiana. He was a member of the 1st Kansas Infantry, along with a few other people in the Dow family. And during the Battle of Wilson's Creek, Missouri, this regiment suffered 106 soldiers KIA, or mortally wounded, and that is one of the highest numbers of casualties of any unit in the Civil War, at least in an individual battle. I nearly confused the 1st Kansas Infantry Regiment with the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, and this was kind of wishful thinking on my part, because the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry Regiment was the first black unit established in a northern state, and it was also one of the units that suffered some of the highest losses. It's awe-inspiring to think of what these settlers went through from bleeding Kansas all the way to the end of the Civil War, and all to be admitted as a free state in the Union.